In Pittsburgh, weatherman Phil reassures his viewers that the incoming blizzard won't reach western Pennsylvania, where the nation's older Groundhog Day festival is held. This will be the 4th year that Phil will be covering that event. He's energetic and funny on camera, but as soon as the recording ends, he shows his true colors. Phil thinks this small news station is beneath him and doesn't treat his coworkers well. On February 2nd, the new team drives to Punxsutawney. Phil keeps complaining about the festival, calling it stupid. His producer, Rita, thinks it's very cute, so Phil judges her for it. When they arrive at the hotel, Phil immediately announces that he can't stay there. He slept there 2 years ago and hated it. However, Rita anticipated this and booked him a bed and breakfast. When she asks him to join them for dinner, Phil says no and insults the way they eat before leaving. Then, Rita and cameraman Larry mock him attitude. The next morning, a bedside clock strikes 6 with the song I Got You Babe. Phil gets ready for work while ignoring the radio hosts who say that the blizzard will come to Punxsutawney. When Phil leaves his room, a man tries to chit-chat about the weather, so Phil gives him a sarcastic answer to get rid of him. In the dining room, the manager tries to chit-chat too and mentions the blizzard. Phil gives her a whole weather presentation with his most sarcastic and annoyed tone, making the mood very awkward. The manager is still nice and wonders if he'll check out today, so he answers that there's a 100% chance of him leaving. Outside, a homeless man is asking for change, and Phil only pretends to search his pockets without the intention of giving him anything. At that moment, Phil is approached by a very enthusiastic man who greets him like an old friend, but he doesn't recognize him. His name is Ned, and they went to school together. He talks a lot, so Phil tries to walk away, but Ned follows him and keeps on rambling. When Ned tries to escape by crossing the street, he steps on a puddle. At the festival, Rita is having a great time, but Phil complains as soon as he arrives. They start their report, and Phil explains how the ritual works for the camera. If the groundhog sees his shadow and returns to his hole, there will be 6 more weeks of winter. If he doesn't, they'll have an early spring. The hosts grab the groundhog and pretend to talk to him to then announce that they'll have more winter, causing the crowd to boo. Phil turns the camera again and makes a sarcastic comment on how exciting the day has been. Rita asks him to try again with a better attitude, but Phil refuses and leaves. When the team tries to go home, they discover that the blizzard has arrived and the highway has been closed. Phil gets angry and goes to argue with the state trooper, refusing to admit his prediction was wrong and calling this weather just a few flakes. The trooper refuses to open the road and sends him back. Afterward, Phil tries to call the weather department, but all the long-distance lines are down. A man accidentally smacks with a snow shovel when he walks by. In the evening, Phil goes to a bar to grab a drink. Rita and Larry show up to ask if he wants to go to the groundhog dinner, but Phil insults them and chooses to be alone in his room. When Phil tries to shower, he finds the water extremely cold, and his mood gets worse. The next morning, the clock strikes 6 again with the same song, and the radio hosts say the blizzard is coming. When they mention the festival, Phil gets confused and looks out the window. There are no signs of the blizzard, which confuses him even more. As he leaves the room, the same man tries to chit-chat about the weather, so Phil pushes him against the wall and wonders if this is a prank. He asks the date and the man says it's February 2nd, which makes no sense. In the dining room, the manager also asks the same weather question, so Phil calls it déjà vu. When she asks if he's checking out today, he answers that there's an 80% chance of him leaving. Outside, Phil sees all the locals going to the festival. The homeless man is in the same corner and Ned approaches Phil again with exactly the same words. This time, Phil remembers his name and says he isn't feeling well before running, only to step on the same puddle. When Phil arrives at the festival, he asks Rita to slap him, which she gladly does. He tells her he's having a weird problem and that they need to talk, but Rita wants to finish the job first. Phil does the presentation and the groundhog's result is the same, so Phil leaves without finishing the report. Back in his room, Phil ends up in a cold shower again. Then he tries to make a call, but the blizzard has arrived and the long-distance lines aren't working. Before going to bed, he breaks a pencil and leaves it on the nightstand. The next morning, the clock strikes 6 with the same song. Phil immediately checks the pencil and finds it in one piece. He rushes out of the room, ignoring the man and the manager, asking the same questions to quickly go outside. On the street, he ignores the homeless man and pushes Ned, stepping on the poodle as he escapes. At the festival, Phil tells Rita that he won't do the report because he's already done it twice and leaves without another word. Later, they meet at a diner and are startled by a waitress dropping the dishes. Phil explains to Rita that he's reliving the same day over and over, but Rita doesn't believe him and thinks he should get his head examined. When Larry says it's time to go, Phil tells him that the roads are closed and he was wrong about the blizzard. Afterward, Phil sees a doctor who runs a bunch of tests but finds nothing wrong. Next, he sees a psychologist who has no way to help him either. Later, he goes to a bowling alley to drink with two locals and complain about the situation, wondering why he couldn't be reliving a nicer day. Since the guys are very drunk, Phil volunteers to drive them home. He asks them what they'd do if there was no tomorrow. So, they say they'd do whatever they wanted, because there are no consequences. Excited by this idea, Phil runs over a mailbox, so a police car starts following them. Phil just makes a sudden turn, and the police have to dodge him, so they end up crashing into some trash cans. Then, Phil takes the car to the train tracks, and the cops keep following them. A train appears in front of them, so Phil makes another quick turn, avoiding it just in time. He laughs as he announces he won't follow the rules anymore. When more police cars appear, Phil makes the car run over a groundhog decoration. An officer immediately comes to the window, and Phil pretends to order fast food from him. Minutes later, he's locked up in a cell. The next morning, Phil wakes up at 6:30 back in his bed. This time, he's excited about the day and quotes all the lines from the radio. In the dining room, he asks the manager if the cops are looking for him, and when she answers no, he kisses her. He also asks her to hold his room for an extra day. On the street, he says no to the homeless man without pretenses and punches Ned in the face. Today, he remembers to avoid the puddle and watches another person step on it instead. At the diner, Phil orders lots of sweet dishes, keeps drinking coffee, and even smokes. He's also not startled by the broken dishes anymore. Rita is worried about his health, but Phil replies that he doesn't worry about anything anymore since he's eating like a pig. Rita uses a quote to call him selfish and implies he'll die alone. When Larry comes to pick them up, Phil refuses to go with them. Once they're gone, he approaches Nancy and asks her a bunch of questions about her life, only to leave without explaining anything. The following day is repeated again, and Phil finds Rita at the festival. He pretends they used to be in the same class together using the information he gathered, and impresses her by saying he works on TV, which convinces her to go on a date with him. After the festival, they go to NY's house to get dirty. Phil keeps unconsciously saying Rita's name. And when Nancy notices, Phil asks her to marry him. A few resets later, Phil has perfectly memorized the incident of a woman distracting two guards at the bank. Since he knows all their movements, he easily approaches the truck and steals a bag of cash, leaving before anyone could see him. That night, Phil goes to the movie theater in a fancy car and dressed like a cowboy. His date is wearing a maid uniform because he told her they'd be going to a costume party. When Nancy walks by, Phil says hi to her, but she doesn't recognize him and ignores him. On another day, Phil asks Rita what she'd do if she only had one day to live, but Rita is confused by this question. Then, Phil takes her to the diner and asks her lots of questions about her life. Rita answers most of them, but doesn't say if she's seeing anyone. Phil admits he wants someone like her and wonders what kind of men she likes, so Rita lists all the characteristics she looks for. Phil thinks they apply to him, but she finds the idea laughable. During another repeat, Phil learns Rita's favorite drink, so he orders it when the day resets to create a connection. He isn't good with the toast though, so he tries again. And this time, he mentions both Rita's drink and toast dedication, which impresses her. Afterward, Phil shows her the best spots in town. Whenever he does something wrong, he tries the day again and fixes his answers. He even learns a bit of French to impress her. One night, while they're building a snowman, some kids throw snowballs at them. They throw some back and have fun until Rita falls. When Phil tries to help her, he falls as well, and they almost kiss. Then, they go to a gazebo and dance together for a long time, almost kissing again. On the way to the bed and breakfast, Rita admits that today was the perfect day. Phil brings her inside and they start kissing on the couch, but Rita says she can't stay tonight and promises to see him tomorrow, desperate not to lose her in the reset. Phil won't let her go and keeps kissing her, even saying that he loves her since they still barely know each other. Rita freaks out and realizes that today was only a setup to get her into bed. Guessing he called her friends to learn all her favorites, she thinks Phil will never love anyone because he loves himself too much and slaps him before leaving. Afterward, Phil tries the date with Rita several times, but the night always ends with her slapping him and leaving. Eventually, he gives up and goes to the festival in an awful mood. During the next reset, he stays inside to drink and watch TV, annoying all the other guests because he knows all the answers to the questions in a game show. As the day continues to reset, Phil's mood gets worse. Sometimes he goes to the festival and says horrible things for the camera. Other times, he breaks the clock. One day, during his report, he mentions that winter can never end as long as the groundhog keeps seeing a shadow. This makes him think that his loop won't end until he stops the groundhog. After the festival, Phil kisses Rita's cheek and asks her to remember that they had a beautiful day once. Then he waits until the hosts are distracted and jumps into their truck to drive it away with the groundhog on his lap. The police immediately start chasing him, and Rita and Larry follow them in the van. After driving through the countryside for a long time, Phil forces the truck to go through a fence to reach a construction site. His co-workers and the cops watch in shock as Phil drives toward the cliff and the truck falls, landing with an explosion. However, Phil doesn't die. He just wakes up in bed at 6:00 again. Refusing to give up, he starts trying different methods to self-de, like a toaster in the bathtub, walking into traffic and jumping off a building. Sometimes Rita and Larry have to identify the body. Eventually, Phil gets tired of this and decides to tell Rita the truth, calling himself a god. Obviously, Rita doesn't believe him, so he drags her around the diner and tells her personal information about every person there. When Rita calls it a trick, Phil predicts the falling dishes. Now Rita is worried and wonders if he knows everything about her, too. Phil lists a lot of details about her and writes down a sentence, which is exactly what Larry says when he comes to pick them up. Rita finally believes him and says she'll spend the day with him just to see what happens. In the evening, the duo is in Phil's room throwing cards at a hat. He's done this so many times that he has perfect aim. Phil is sad that tomorrow Rita will forget about this and think he's a jerk again, but Rita thinks he should see this as a blessing and not a curse. She wants to wait until 6 to see what happens. However, she ends up falling asleep cuddling him. Phil kisses her cheek and says how much he loves her. On the next reset, Phil decides to follow Rita's advice. After giving all his pocket money to the homeless man, he shows up at the festival with coffee and pastries for his team. He has an idea for a better spot for the report and helps them move the equipment. Once his job is done, he starts doing more intellectual things like reading thick books and learning to play the piano. In the morning, Phil is more friendly with the guy in the corridor and even chats back. He continues to take up hobbies, and thanks to all the repetition, he becomes a great piano player and learns how to make beautiful ice sculptures. The next time he sees Ned, he hugs him and says he missed him. So Ned runs away in fear. One night, he sees the homeless man shivering on the street and takes him to the hospital. Unfortunately, the old man dies anyway. Phil is determined to fix it. So during the next reset, he finds the man early and takes him to the diner to feed him. Sadly, the man drops still dead when they leave. The next day during the festival, Phil gives a beautiful speech to deal with his grief, which is admired by everyone. Rita asks him if he wants to grab a cup of coffee, but he turns her down because he has some errands to take care of. Then he runs to a tree down the street and catches a falling kid just in time. This is how Phil spends the repetitions from now on helping people. He changes the tire of some old lady's car, gives the Heimlich maneuver to a man choking on his steak, lights NY's cigarette, and plays the piano at a party with a band. Rita is attending this party and is impressed by Phil again. When Phil has a break, he dances with Rita, but they keep getting interrupted by all the people who Phil helped coming to thank him. The host announces they're doing a bachelor auction for charity, so Phil volunteers as a bachelor. All the women are fighting over him, and Rita has to offer almost $400 to win. Larry also volunteers, but nobody is interested, and an old woman ends up getting him for $25. Afterward, Phil takes Rita outside and makes a nice sculpture of her, which she thinks is beautiful. Phil says that no matter what happens tomorrow, he's happy now because he loves her. Rita admits she's happy too, and they kiss. The next morning, the clock strikes at 6 sound with the same song. Phil is annoyed until Rita moves to turn it off, which means the day has finally changed. Still a bit unsure, he asks Rita about yesterday, and she mentions the auction while they share some kisses. Then Phil checks the window and sees all the snow from the blizzard. Feeling incredibly happy, Phil gets back in bed to celebrate with Rita. Moments later, the new couple comes out and Phil concludes they should move to this town together. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.